Welcome to the Better Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm Ciaran O'Connor.
I'm John Wood Jr.
What's cracking, John?
What's good, Ciaran?
Welcome to 2019.
I know, right? What is saying? Do I have a mug? Oh, I got my glass of water here. Yeah, man. Cheers. It is a new year full of new possibilities, man.
You got any resolutions?
You know, I do.
Okay. You keep them close to the vest?
Well, it's not so much that. I don't like the term resolution only because I feel like it's been tainted by the 99% of people who make New Year's resolutions and then don't keep them,
right?
You know? So
yeah, I've been in that camp before.
Yeah,
I can't lie.
I think we all have. So I like to just consider it a plan and a goal, and I've stuck to it mostly already. To get up at 4:30 in the morning each morning to run a mile and a half and meditate for 30 minutes before I even get to work and breakfast and so forth. And you can't look at it as totally messed up if you miss a day. Like this morning, I did get up at 4:30.
Yeah,
but I kind of
you're on a whole nother level, brother.
Stayed up. You know, I'm trying to make up for all of the laziness in my overly idle past.
Well, I find that hard to believe. You know, my resolution is very general and vague, which I kind of like. Just live healthy,
okay,
continue to develop as a person, and depolarize America.
It's easy,
so
right? we can do that.
Well, we have a lot of stuff to cover today. Obviously, the government's still shut down.
Yeah.
The immigration divide is still there. It doesn't seem like, speaking of resolutions, that is going to get substantively resolved anytime soon.
How many days has it been? Do you know?
I think it's been 17. Obviously, President Trump addressed the nation last night, as did Speaker Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. Senator Schumer from the fine state of New York, from where I hail. But before we get into the news, I thought we should take this opportunity to tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about our next upcoming national event, the Better Angels State of the Union Address. So, John, what is the Better Angels State of the Union?
Well, the Better Angels State of the Union, a momentous occasion. No, actually, it is a very significant thing. So what we're doing with Better Angels is we are going to be live streaming our own State of the Union address 2 days after the President's State of the Union and the Democratic response, which I believe is scheduled for January 29th. So
President Trump's address is on the 29th.
Right.
And the Better Angels State of the Union will be 2 days after. Right. So January 31st.
That's right. Yeah, we are going to be live streaming from a private location with an audience of Reds and Blues in attendance, Better Angels delegates and leaders, and also likely some journalists and other figures and so forth.
Hopefully.
Right. And the point of the address, in the words of, I think the way David Blankenhorn would describe it, Better Angels president, is that what we're going to hear from the president and also from the Democratic opposition on the 29th is going to be about the State of the Union, but really it's going to focus more on the state of our divide. That is to say that, what these presidential States of the Unions and the responses usually do is highlight the things that are sort of driving us apart. Whereas we, with the Better Angels State of the Union, want to take the time to point out and to show what it is that Americans are actually uniting over and how it is that Better Angels and a larger sort of depolarization movement, I think, is coalescing to restore the fabric of American civil society, to remind us of what really bonds us together as Americans, and to pave a vision for people watching as to how it is that they can be a part of moving our civic society forward.
Right. Well put. And I also think it'll be an invitation to the country writ large. Tell them a little bit about who we are, what we do, and get people involved.
Yeah.
So look out for that. You can go to our website. If you want to sign up to host a watch party, you can do that. So as John mentioned, we'll be broadcasting from a living room in Washington, D.C. We'll have an audience there, about 100 folks, half liberal, half conservative. And we're also going to have hundreds of our members across the country hosting their own living room watch parties, tuning into the live stream, and helping grow our movement going into the new year.
Yeah, and probably a lot more than just those people too. As the live stream goes up on social media and people share it around and so forth. So it's something that everybody can participate in making a big thing. So we'll include a link in the description below so you can see how it is that you can get involved. And it's definitely something that folks don't want to miss. So
definitely.
I'm excited.
So let's jump into the news.
Man.
It's always a whirlwind these days. But we're sort of very topical. Obviously, the government's been shut down for 17 days.
As of this recording.
Right. I presume it'll continue to remain shut down for at least a few more days and potentially longer. And obviously, the main sticking point is the immigration debate, but more specifically, the wall. Which obviously was one of Trump's central promises in the campaign and one that he continues to harp on as something that he needs to get, for his base, or he's not going to reopen the government. Well,
and I think the argument that he made last night, so you and I are speaking here, when folks see this, it'll be a couple days after the fact, but you and I are speaking here the morning after Trump's Oval Office address on this subject last night. Right?
Prime time.
Right, exactly. Primetime address. And I'm trying to think, had President Trump ever had a Oval Office?
This is his first.
This was his first.
2 years in.
Exactly. So that, that suggests the political importance of the moment, both in terms of how he sees it and, just as a landmark of his presidency, And I thought that, so I was a couple minutes late in getting to watch it. I was struck by a couple of things. For one, I thought that the address that he gave was, there didn't seem to be anything new in it. A lot of people had a suspicion that he might do something dramatic or declare something drastic, like he might be using emergency powers to appropriate, I guess, Pentagon funds in order to build a wall to secure the national defense or something like that. He didn't do anything like that. He just sort of recapitulated the arguments that he has been making, which is to say that, the southern border is just this big open wound through which we have crime and drugs and, various ne'er-do-wells and so forth streaming across the border, and that the American people are suffering as a result of this. And of course, he did highlight poignant examples of, law enforcement officers. Like we had a police officer killed in the state of California very recently by an undocumented immigrant with a criminal history who I suppose would have been deported if it had not been for sanctuary city policies and so forth. I mean, he pointed to some real human suffering, but he's been doing that all along. He didn't really bring anything new, I think, in terms of proposals or arguments in defense of his position. And then we had Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi's response to the president, which I also sort of thought didn't carry anything new. They did highlight the fact that the Democrats had voted in favor of, because obviously Trump made the point that it's Schumer and Pelosi who don't want to compromise.
The Schumer shutdown.
The Schumer shutdown, right? The Schumer shutdown.
Alliterative flair.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And they made the point that they did vote for to approve a Republican bill passed in the Republican-led Senate that the president was initially,
which did include money for border security.
Yeah, I guess.
But it didn't obviously apportion funds for the construction of a physical barrier.
Right, exactly. And Trump was initially of a mind to sign it until he experienced resistance, from the base in the Republican Party and certain key conservative commentators, Ann Coulter, among others, and so forth. And so now we're in this position where neither side is giving any ground, even as the pain of the shutdown mounts. And after last night, I don't really see that anything fundamentally has changed. Do you?
I agree. I don't think anything was new. I think it was sort of a reinforcement of Trump's message and also the Democrats' message. I'd say a couple things. One is that I think Trump has really been trying to create the sense that there's a real crisis. He used that word over and over again, a humanitarian crisis and a national security crisis. And I think the Democrats' central message, at least insofar as it's been communicated by the party leadership, is that a wall is both unsensible and also amoral, which is one of the terms that Nancy Pelosi's been using. Right. And I think, obviously, on a cultural level, though, that's a tough gap to bridge. Right. The other point I would make is that I think a lot of the nuances of what's actually going on at the border and what are sensible solutions to explore to resolve the issues there have been sort of elided and neglected. Yeah. So I think if we talk about a border crisis, I think in some ways we do have a border crisis, but it's not the border crisis that President Trump is talking about. So President Trump talks about, illegal immigrants streaming across our border. Right. He uses very dramatic language that, in my view, is sort of rooted in fear. Drugs are coming across our border. Violent criminals are coming across our border. He said terrorists are coming across, and then obviously points to these specific examples, of crimes perpetrated by undocumented immigrants in the country. Right. But I think the facts show that that's not actually happening. Illegal immigration of people crossing the border and sort of, eluding Border Patrol agents has continued to decline over the past few years. And the majority of illegal immigration, I think, is people overstaying their visas within the United States. Right. At the same time, there is a humanitarian crisis at the border, and that's been caused by an influx of immigrants coming from Central America. And whereas
crossings from Mexico have actually declined quite a bit, but from Central America, it's
correct.
Increased.
And whereas migrants in the past had traditionally been single men traveling alone or traveling in groups, the influx now is primarily comprised of families. But the key point here is that these families are not trying to sneak across the border. They're just not. Right. What they are doing is presenting at so-called ports of entry. I think the biggest is the one between San Diego and Tijuana. I actually drove down to Mexico a few months ago to go to El Valle de Guadalupe, which is the wine tasting region. So highly recommend checking that out if you're in California. Right. But just to get back to the point, these folks are presenting at ports of entry and applying for asylum, essentially saying we are fleeing violence and hardship, and we would like to have asylum in our country. So that seems to be the real humanitarian crisis, because we have all these families coming and sort of overwhelming our system and ability to process these claims, and essentially living in tent cities, and obviously you've seen the rise of disease. 2 children died. And I think our capacity at the border to house these people and process these people is just, we don't have it right now. Yeah. And so I think that's kind of the main sticking point there, is that those two issues have been confused, because I think obviously putting up a wall is not going to do anything about that. And I think if you talk to a lot of Border Patrol agents themselves and immigration policy experts, they would sort of delineate these two crises and try to make a point that the Central Americans at ports of entry is really what's causing the images of pain and suffering at the border. So I think those policy questions are really important, because it matters, right? It matters to actually solve the problem. Well, but the larger cultural divide obviously remains in terms of welcoming folks at the border, being a beacon for folks who have experienced hardship and want to come to America, versus, keeping our borders secure and recognizing the fact that, a large percentage of these drugs that are ravaging communities are coming from Mexico. But again, I think a huge percentage of those are actually coming through the ports of entry, which is, where we do have the physical barrier. Right. So
I think that you're right to separate in some sense to separate the problem itself, the actual practical problem of illegal or undocumented immigration, and how to secure and or process immigrants coming over that border in an effective way, from the sort of social and cultural political conversation that we're having around it. And I think I agree with the vast majority of how you analyze the problem itself, but I'd like to give my own perspective on it very quickly. Yeah, it's definitely different from immigration in the past. I mean, total illegal immigration. I was just pulling up some statistics here, and I'm looking at this chart from factcheck.org. Somebody might want to factcheck.org, but
fact check,
right? But according to them, in 2002, we had something like 1 million and over 1,600,000 people cross into the country, and I don't know whether this is just border crossings or what, but no, I'm sorry, these are apprehensions at the southern border. Okay, so apprehensions at the southern border peaked at about 1,600,000 around 2002, 2003. That number is closer to between 200,000 and 300,000 now, right? So, yeah, you're right. I mean, the overall number has diminished dramatically, but what has risen substantially and what has changed substantially is, well, the demographics of the people coming over. They're Central American primarily, no longer Mexican primarily, but more importantly, they tend to be families, fathers, mothers, and children, as opposed to just young men and so forth. That makes a tremendous difference in terms of customs and Border Patrol and ICE's and nonprofits' ability to actually process people coming through. So the humanitarian crisis stems from the fact that Trump is actually right, I think, in that we don't have the resources in the southern border to actually be able to handle the influx coming in. Now, as far as the wall itself is concerned, just a quick side point about that. Yeah, a lot of people are coming to ports of entry. I read a great article in the National Review this morning that made the point. The editorial that made the point that one of the reasons why people are coming at ports of entry at the frequency that they are is because actual physical barriers in places like Yuma, Arizona, and other border towns are actually making it impossible to cross over foot in areas where people otherwise would and where families, in certain cases, otherwise would. So there's some evidence to suggest that the current existence of certain physical structures is actually effective in that it's keeping people from crossing at places where they otherwise would not go through a check-in process, and now they have to go through a port of entry because those are the more viable, physically viable places. Right,
and realistically, you know, if you're traveling with two small children, you're not going to be able to do some of the more adventurous ways of crossing, going out into the desert and swimming across the Rio Grande. Not to say that some people don't try, but those are the places, in my understanding, where we don't have the wall.
Well, I mean, yeah, because you have natural barriers in certain places, right? So, yeah, I mean, and, you and I talked last time, and honestly, it does seem that among people who are educated on this topic, there's actually a consensus that physical barriers do make sense in certain places.
Right.
And, maybe that could and should be expanded in certain areas where there are gaps in terms of natural or physical protections existing along the border currently. But that that's where it starts to cross into this cultural and social conversation that's so difficult, because as Trump is quick to point out, and as most Reds are quick to point out, Democrats have voted for border fencing in the past. This idea hasn't really been super controversial previously, right? Let's zoom out really quick, because here's what I see. I see a situation where you do have an authentic and genuine humanitarian crisis on the border. At the same time that you have a crisis that is directly related to the fact that American agencies like ICE and Border Patrol and so forth are completely overwhelmed in their ability to process people. Because if it's single men coming in and so forth, you can detain them, or you can send them into the country to await a court hearing or whatnot to process an asylum claim. But when you're dealing with families and small children, suddenly the housing requirements, the medical attention, and so forth, all of that just becomes dramatically more complicated. The legal implications of holding on to small children and so forth. So, and yet, half of the political conversation, well, not, a certain amount of political conversation has been focused on sort of, I think, demonizing ICE and Border Patrol as being sort of heartless and not trying to take care of these people. And I think that, I mean, Vox, you probably read that Vox article, which really highlighted a lot of this. And Vox is a strongly left-leaning publication.
Right.
But, you look at what's going on and you realize, ICE and Border Patrol, they weren't set up to be able to process this kind of thing. So, it's not all that it's not all that constructive to demonize the agencies. But because Trump, I guess, lauds the agencies as sort of the vanguard of law and order in our society, it sets up a situation to where in order to be on the side of immigrants, you have to be anti-ICE, at least in the way that some people are formulating the conversation. And so what does that stem from? It stems from the way we've campaigned all the way up until this moment. So people who are educated on the issue can look at what's going on at the border and say, okay, we've got a humanitarian crisis. We need more resources so that we can process people, both for the government agencies and for the nonprofits who actually do the real work of taking care of people after they've been, processed and released by, Border Patrol and ICE and so forth. We need more resources for those organizations. We need to have reasonable lines of defense, whether it's a physical barrier, whether it's technology, et cetera, to be able to reduce the overall traffic over the border. You need to make the resource allotments to that, and we can look at different sorts of policies in the United States that might be contributing to sort of attracting greater flow and so on and so forth, greater flow of undocumented immigration. But you can't have a practical conversation about a problem like this when, on the one side, I would say on the conservative side, you have a political conversation about this issue that really, in the context of Trump, started off with a very precise kind of demagoguing of Mexican immigrants, granted illegal immigrants, but of Mexican immigrants in particular, and a sort of stoking of fear around the subject of immigration in general on the one hand.
Also pushing a false narrative that there are masses of people coming across our border.
I'd like to hit that point in a second too. But then on the blue side, I would say on the Democratic side, campaigning in a way that says that just about any sort of meaningful attempt at compromise with this president, whether that's the explicit statement or the implicit statement, by at every sort of point kind of making the point that this president represents an existential threat to the country itself, it puts, I think, Democratic lawmakers and leaders in a position to where even what in other circumstances would seem like reasonable policy compromises now can no longer seriously be considered because they would threaten to politically empower this president, and there's no way folks want to risk him, being reelected or to minimize the chances that he'll be held to account politically by the American people.
But I would say that, from the Democrats' perspective, they have already agreed to reasonable policy compromises that have already been agreed to by Republicans in Congress. So, approving more money for border security, but in their view, money that's going to go toward actually solving the crisis in terms of more money for Border Patrol agents and their capacity to take care of this influx of families, and hopefully pairing that with some priorities on the left, like solidifying DACA and sort of moving toward a pathway to citizenship for immigrants that are already here. And so that policy compromise was already approved by Republicans, at least insofar as saying, well, let's reopen the government and then continue talks on that.
By Senate Republicans.
Senate Republicans, right. So I think the situation now is the Democrats' position, and partly I think because they think they're in a advantageous posture politically, but also to say, well, let's reopen the government and then continue these negotiations. And I think there is a sort of basis for a reasonable policy compromise, which includes more money for border security. And potentially part of that could go toward more fencing, in places like Yuma to have more effective deterrence. But to sort of, hold the government hostage in some ways and saying, until I get my $5.7 billion specifically for a wall, and I think a much less amount of money going toward this other side of the problem. I think that's tough, and I don't think you're going to see Democrats come around on that until the government is open.
Yeah, well, I don't think that you see, this is the difficult thing about our situation, because I'm not sure what the political out is for either side, given the way they've committed to campaigning. But you and I agree on terms of, I think, just what the material priorities here are. See, Ciaran, I may be naive or optimistic, but I kind of feel like and I'm not campaigning for us to be in this position, but I feel like if you and I were sitting across the table here,
sit down and hammer it out.
I feel like we could knock this thing out.
Probably be good to get some folks in their room who actually know about this stuff.
Oh no, yeah. But here's what I'm saying though, because again, I just want to draw attention to this fact, and we talked about this last time around as well. The government has been shut down for 17 days in the midst of argument over a very important issue. I mean, both border security and humane immigration policy that, in Nancy Pelosi's words, quote, reflects our values, right? And I agree, that's what we want. Both vital issues. That issue has been stalled and the government has been shut down and people are not receiving their paychecks and government services aren't being affected. I mean, aren't in action over a difference over what is ultimately legit like 0.12% of annual federal spending. It is about a $5.7 billion expenditure. The federal government spends about $4 trillion a year. Granted, we borrow, a fair amount of that, but even so. And the reason I make that point is to just draw attention to I hate to say it this way, but just how petty our politics has become at this point. Because honestly, you can believe that the idea of the wall is totally impractical and political pandering. You can believe that entire $5.7 billion is a complete waste of money.
Right.
But I would say that in a saner moment, if I were Democratic leadership, right, in a saner moment, what I would probably be tempted to do or say is, okay, we all think that this is a waste of money. We don't need a wall. Or if we need fencing, we don't need, what it is the president is talking about. But Trump and Pence have come back and said, okay, well, how about 2.5 billion? How about 2 billion?
Well, Pence has said that.
Pence said that the president had empowered that request.
Right. But I would just say the idea that
even if it was at 5, though, even if it was 5, because really, in the grand scheme of things, it's not
small potatoes.
It's not a huge difference. I would want to be able to come back and say, okay, we can go with this idea of $5 billion for fencing. Let's call it fencing. Let's call it a barrier. But let's make sure that we have concrete protections for the dreamers. Let's make sure that we have a process that works humanely for people seeking asylum in this country. Let's make sure that we make this process humane, that little kids aren't dying because the border bureaucracy is overwhelmed, that they're not receiving medical treatment at the border and so forth. Let's make sure we get our priorities accomplished. And if your priority, Mr. President, is getting this wall up or getting this barrier up, so on and so forth, well, we can give you that, but we'll be able to go back to our constituents and say, yeah, we threw away a little bit of money on Trump's border wall. That's his project. That's his fantasy. But what we were able to do for our people is see to it that young men, that children and families crossing this border are treated humanely, that people who are already here in this country, who know other young people who know no other home other than the United States of America, have security now in their residence in this nation, and federal workers are back to work. That would be a pragmatic sort of policy approach, I think, to dealing with this president and this issue that just seems to me that most Americans and Democrats, and certainly the people who are suffering, both from the shutdown and the immigration policy itself, would benefit from, and then we could come back and rehash everything in the next presidential election. But the culture war does not allow it. Right. And to me, that is the tragedy, because I feel like we're all so caught up in Trump winning or Pelosi winning that we don't recognize just how stupidly everybody is acting in this.
Totally. No, I take your point. I think we need the time to really come together and do this in a thoughtful way, and I don't think that's going to happen while the government is shut down. Well, I also think, and
yet, how does the government become unshut down if that doesn't?
Well, I think Trump's going to have to fold, because you're already seeing Senate Republicans come out and say we need to reopen the government. So, I think eventually Mitch McConnell's going to have to step in. So, but who knows? I mean, I've sort of tried to go out of the business of making political predictions with certainty, given my experience on the Hillary campaign in 2016.
It really is ominous. Actually, you said something that made me think, too. So you were talking about how Trump has sort of mischaracterized the nature of the problem and so forth by suggesting that we have this enormous epidemic of illegal immigration that's leading to all these terrible things. And I did something that, I voluntarily gave myself whiplash last night because as soon as the president's address and Chuck and Nancy's response was finished. By the way, have you seen the memes for Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi?
I don't think so. I've been off Twitter. I think I might have to get back on.
Well, it's funny because, and I kind of I was trying to figure out who they reminded me of. Because, they were kind of, the visual was kind of weird a little bit, right? Because they're very stoic, right? In their response. And Trump looked kind of weird to me too, but Trump's always kind of got this sort of like one eye sort of squinted, the other eye kind of open. My dad makes a very similar face when he was mad at me as a kid. My dad would do this thing where one eye would close, the other eye would open really big. And I'm like, oh boy, what's he about to do? But people have been comparing Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi to the American Goth
Really?
picture. You know what I'm talking about? That old picture of like the farmer and his wife in front of the barn house.
Maybe we can get that up on the screen.
One of them's got wait, maybe I can find it. It's you know it. It's a classic picture, and the original version I think they're actually brother and sister. The people actually both. But anyway, but what I did after listening to everybody's addresses was I turned to MSNBC, and Rachel Maddow was on, and I was listening to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was on as a guest. And, she was making the point that... Okay, here you go. Watch. Remember this here? Can you see this?
Yeah, I've seen that, but that's a famous painting.
That's a famous painting, right. Well, now they've got a Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi memes that are meant to go along with it. The tweets have been hilarious. In any event, I turned on Rachel Maddow and listened to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about first-hand testimonies about how immigrants coming into this country and people who are here without documentation but who are applying themselves to the pursuit of the American dream are all suffering because of the president's policies, right? And then I turned from that to Sean Hannity on Fox News, talking about how because of the immigration status quo, we have Americans who are being, law enforcement officers being killed in California, people being raped in certain instances. And he's not just, he's saying this, but he's also naming names. He's providing examples and so on and so forth. And, Rachel Maddow made the point that if you look at the crime rates from undocumented immigrants, it actually is lower than the rate of crimes committed by native-born Americans, right? And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez responded and said, which belies the president's whole narrative. It shows that they're lying about illegal immigrants and so forth. But Trump also gave, and I haven't fact-checked all these statistics, but I'm not sure that they're necessarily wrong. Trump gave numbers that I forget. I think he said something like, what was it, 30,000 violent assaults from, undocumented immigrants within a certain, year-long period, or maybe it was longer than that. I'm not sure, but he gave absolute total figures, right? Taken out of any sort of, percentage context of total population versus immigrant population, so on and so forth. But the thing that struck me is the fact that, they're both right in a sense, because even though it's true that and I really want to know how you feel about what I'm about to say here, because I'm just coming at you from the heart here, and my own analysis of, the implication of the statistics. But even if it's true, and I think it is true, that undocumented immigrants commit fewer crimes on average than do native-born Americans.
Yeah.
And therefore, it is unfair to characterize undocumented or illegal immigrants as being rapists and murderers and so forth in any kind of general sense, which was, to me, pretty much precisely what Donald Trump did when he began this conversation during the campaign, when he announced his candidacy. Nevertheless, every crime that is committed, or every murder, every, rape or whatever it might be, assault, every crime that is committed by somebody who is, here without documentation or here illegally, is nevertheless an incident that would not have occurred, and therefore a suffering experienced by, a native-born American that would not have occurred if immigration policy or security was more effective or more restrictive, potentially, right? And so you may remember, Ciaran, but when Trump was campaigning, he had an African-American man who frequently appeared with him in different places, particularly in California, by the name of Jamil Shah, older man, probably in his 50s, I think. And he's from South Central LA. His son was a well-liked high school student, football player, very popular, very good student, good reputation, killed by he may have been MS-13, but killed by a Latino gangbanger who was in the country illegally, right? And Trump brought this guy with him to a lot of places to put a human face on the suffering of the American people and of the African American community in particular in response to, the scourge of undocumented immigration. Well, I know that guy, and I know his family. I don't know them super well, but I met them back when I was campaigning, and I've talked to him and his relatives on at least a few occasions. I know their story. You know? And his story is not necessarily indicative of the average story of even families who lose, African-American families in particular, who lose young people to gun violence and so forth. Usually it's not at the hands of Hispanic or Latino gangbangers or anything like that. But that story is out there. Mm-hmm. The officer who was killed, recently in California, that's a real story. Fox News didn't make that up, They don't have to make up those kinds of anecdotes because they're real and they exist. And what occurs to me is just the difficulty, or maybe just the lack of incentive for the partisan sort of, mouthpieces to analyze the kind of experiences, American experiences undergirding this problem, to be able to give voice to both sides of this reality. That on the one hand, we do have a problem with demagoguing undocumented immigrants that leads and various policy problems that leads to the suffering of people coming into this country, of immigrants and children of immigrants who are already in this country. And also, on the other hand, there are consequences to our policies that allow for people in the United States of America who are native-born to suffer at the hands of people who should not be here, because it's very difficult to have a policy that works well for all the people who should be here, or who at least should have a chance to apply to come in here, coming across the border, that doesn't also allow for the possibility that some people who shouldn't be here are going to tag along with them or find their own ways in, right? Because it's a multivariate and multifaceted and complex problem. So we choose one group of the American people to sympathize with over the other. And one party speaks for one side, the other party speaks to the other side. But in the meantime, very few of us are left with an appreciation of the holistic nature of the suffering that's attending a problem like immigration. So I feel a lot of sympathy with both sides of that. I just want to know sort of, how you feel about the whole kind of range of experiences going on there as you see it.
No, I think it's well put. And I think each side, although it's sort of in some ways a false dichotomy and binary to say there's, people who are suffering at the hands of crimes from illegal immigrants versus activists who think that's not a problem. I think you need to have empathy for both sides. And I think any sort of reasonable, bipartisan compromise on immigration will need a recognition from both sides that we do need more effective border security. Right. And I think the vast majority of people on the left agree with that and think part of the problem is that we don't have effective border security. So folks who want to come into the country try to take advantage of loopholes because they feel like if I show up and try to present for asylum, I'm going to have to wait for months and months in a tent city. Right. So maybe I want to take more of a chance to get into the country illegally. Yeah. So, no, I completely agree with you that this empathetic, holistic view of things, which is much needed, oftentimes gets lost. That's a good term. I've never heard that. Empathetic, holistic. Yeah. I'm gonna steal that at some point. Yeah. So, John, you mentioned Ocasio-Cortez. Yes, I did. And I'd be curious to get your thoughts on her as an emerging political figure. Obviously, she is polarizing, and just undeniably so in terms of galvanizing the left and also sort of galvanizing the right in opposition to her. Right. So I'd be curious, as a fellow young person with a lot of dynamism and charisma who, got into the political world at a young age, and did so in sort of a fresh way. I'm just curious what you think of Cortez.
Not with quite so much success as she's.
Well, that's true. I mean, it's been pretty meteoric and pretty incredible.
At this stage, right? Well, short answer is I like her at least on a personality sort of basis.
Do you follow her on Instagram?
I don't really follow much. I'm on Instagram. I follow a few people, but I don't. I check out Instagram like once a week or something like that.
She is amazing.
Is she amazing?
She is amazing.
On Instagram?
Because there was that incident where I think some, right-wing provocateurs on Twitter were circulating a video of her dancing in college.
Yeah, well, I got
and sort of saying, this is not conduct befitting a member of the esteemed Congress of the United States. And then she posted a video, which maybe we can show, of her dancing again in Congress and sort of saying, hey, Republicans, if you didn't like that, you're really not going to like this.
Okay.
And it's, it's sort of a tease, but it's kind of like, I think it's an effective way of galvanizing people and also kind of just pointing out, let's have a little bit of fun here. Let's show our personality and let's be true and honest. And she also, uses her Instagram story to open up the rather opaque process of becoming a member of Congress and just sort of being very real and vulnerable and saying, I'm worried about this. I don't know what's happening. Here's my new pin. Here's my new friend, blah, blah, blah. So
she's an actual human being.
Exactly.
That's what's cool about her. Now, you brought up the dancing video. So I saw that video, I think, around the time it first hit Twitter, and I saw the guy who initially tweeted that saying something like, "Oh, look, it's everybody's favorite commie know-it-all acting like the nitwit we all know her to be."
Right.
And I looked at the video, and I was like, "Oh, this is awesome!" Like,
yeah, it's a cool video.
Yeah, it's like her.
She's got some skills.
Oh, she can dance. She can move. Like I tweeted, I was like, God, I would have been in love with her in high school. She, I think she was redoing a scene from Footloose or something, which I never saw, but
yeah, but she's got some swag.
But I was a little annoyed. Now, I didn't see her follow-up video, but I heard you just describe it here, and I heard other people describe it. The thing that annoys me a little bit is that my understanding is that in that video, she did, well, basically what you just said she did, which was to say, hey, Republicans, this is not, if you didn't like that last thing, you definitely won't like this. But I was following the Twitter fallout from that. The guy who posted that video in that critical way was a QAnon guy. I don't know if you know anything about this whole QAnon thing.
Right.
It's kind of weird and nebulous, and I don't really understand it myself. But the point is that every conservative from like Ben Shapiro and Guy Benson and just down a long list of people retweeted that video and said, actually, this is the best thing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has done for me so far. Like, the conservative response to that video was actually about as positive as the liberal response to it. So, it does seem to me a little bit cynical, because I think she's got people around her would say, hey, this is a great opportunity to make these Republicans look like stuffy douchebags and so forth. But having said that, I mean, her basic appeal is just like I said. I mean, she's in contrast to like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi looking like statues behind the podium the other night. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez comes off as warm. She comes off as sincere and friendly. She also comes off as a bit green. She comes off as a person who maybe doesn't quite have as strong a command of the actual, data underwriting a lot of the issues that she may be commenting on.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah,
and I think she'll develop that over time.
Mm-hmm. But as a upcoming leader of the Democratic Party, obviously she's got great appeal, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not she continues to hold on to sort of a Democratic socialist sort of orthodoxy, because that's what's polarizing about it. If she had just been a regular liberal Democrat who won that primary, I don't think conservatives would be quite as, on edge about her. It's the fact that she's embraced the label Democratic Socialist, I think.
Yeah, well, I'd be curious to hear what you think about that, because I actually don't think her proposals are that radical.
I can't say I really know.
She proposed a 70% tax rate on the richest Americans.
Okay. Yeah,
the super rich. Mm-hmm. But if you look at, I think that's what the tax rate was under Jimmy Carter and presidents before, and times of robust economic growth at a time when the gap between the wealthiest Americans and the average American was much smaller.
Yeah.
So regardless of whether you disagree with that, I think some of the reception has just been, oh my God, like craziness. This shows that she's not serious.
Well,
or the idea of a Green Deal, too, which obviously, as you said, I don't think a lot of the policy specifics have been worked out. But just the recognition that we need bold action to really tackle this crisis of climate change is not inherently radical. I tend to agree that we sort of do need something bold. And obviously, we do have a history of taking bold action on climate, if you start with the Clean Air Act. So that's to get off a bit of a tangent. I do agree that, you know, she's not afraid of...
She's fearless.
Yeah, she's not afraid of doing a little bit of trolling, and I think she, you know,
social
knows
media
that she
savvy,
is
for
dynamic and bold and is being perceived as a breath of fresh air by people on the left. And, you know, I think she could run for president in 10 or 15 years. I mean, she already has a bigger social media audience than Nancy Pelosi, in the same way that Trump is able to just communicate directly with his supporters. She can do the same on the left and conceivably activate you know, large portion of the Democratic base that doesn't always get out to vote, that doesn't always feel like the politicians represent them. So it'll be interesting to track her career. But I find her exciting.
Yeah, well, I mean, she is exciting, just objectively speaking.
Yeah.
Even if you're politically opposed to her, she obviously has an energy and a dynamism and a personality, and like you said, there's a vulnerable sort of aspect to her. She really does come across as sort of like the girl next door, and that's believable because up until a few months ago, nobody knew who the heck she was. She primaried her,
and she's from the South Bronx.
And of course, you know that part of town pretty well, I guess.
I do.
You know
I
her
mean,
district,
I've been
Jamaica,
up there, but
Queens,
she, you know, she's someone who, you know, is known in the neighborhood. Really came to politics from outside the political world, from activism, and I think she was a teacher before.
So there's something refreshing.
And I think she's sort of the leader of this new wave of Democratic congressional leaders. So I'd be curious to hear what you thought of that. I just thought the images when the Democrats were swearing in were really striking. I mean, you have by far the most diverse class of Democrats as ever before. You know, I think you had there's a couple of Palestinian congresswomen, including Rashida Tlaib, who, you know, wore, I think, traditional Palestinian garb, and I think the first ever Native American congresswoman sort of wore traditional garb. And so you just had folks representing people who have never had people in Congress who look like them, sort of giving a voice to those identities. And you had sort of that youthful energy. And then you sort of contrast that with, you know, a bunch of old white guys wearing business suits. And, you know, not to reduce things to how people look, but I did think that image was just really striking. I mean, just sort of the gender and racial disparity between the Democrats and the Republicans, I do think sort of bespeaks a larger dynamic that we have to pay attention to when we speak about political polarization. So I don't know if you saw that, but I was jazzed up seeing them swear in. Just, you know, the energy, all the kids, and it was just, it had a different vibe than you saw. And obviously they won, so
yeah. Well, of course. So naturally, they're excited.
Yeah.
I saw the picture of the freshman class. I didn't see all of the ceremony and so forth. But you know, obviously the demographic difference is apparent at a glance. You just sort of know looking who the Democrats are and who the Republicans are without anybody having to tell you. For the most part, look, man, I have a bit of a nuanced sort of reaction to the analysis that
I'm not surprised that you would take a sensible, nuanced, and to reference what I said earlier, a holistic, empathetic approach.
Yes, I have a holistic, empathetic
there you
approach
go.
to
Patriotic empathy.
Patriotic empathy, indeed. That's what we're about here at Better Angels. See, the thing is, so you drew attention to the fact that you have a number of, I guess, sort of political pioneers in this incoming freshman class, in as much as it is culturally diverse and reflects sort of reflects in a sense the America we want to see, in as much as we want to think of this as a country that affords people of all walks of life an opportunity to not just succeed at the highest level, but also to have a say in and assume a leadership sort of role in their government, right? And that's part of the idea of, the promise of this country being a land of opportunity for all, not just for, one group of people or the other, right? And so to that extent, I'm pleased about it, just as you are, right? So I'm a Republican who comes from a very multicultural background,
right?
And so I sympathize with the sort of affinity for the multicultural kind of perspective and aspect of American character. But there's another degree to which I'm not particularly excited about it at all, because I haven't seen. Now, look, we've spent some minutes talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and I agree that she's dynamic and likable, and I like her personality a lot. There's a lot of things that seem great about her as a human being.
Right.
But I don't see anything from the incoming Democratic class or the Republicans, much for that matter, that gives me a lot of hope in terms of there being a culture of patriotic empathy between these two lines of the political divide asserting itself within this new class. If anything, I've got a great deal of apprehension. So you mentioned Rashida Tlaib. Was she the one who
She's the one who called Trump a motherfucker.
Well, she's the one who said we're going to
impeach the motherfucker.
Yeah, we're going to impeach the mother.
I'm not afraid of saying it.
Right. Well,
bleep, bleep. Mofo.
But that's point being that's what she said. And she ran on impeaching the president. But even so, I had a feeling in response to that similar to the feeling I had when Trump said to Hillary Clinton during the debate something along the lines of, she said something like, I wouldn't want you to be president or in charge of the Justice Department. He said, that's because if I did, you'd be in jail or something like that. The chance of lock her up and so forth. Granted, we can play this tit for tat thing where, if you tell me, well, yeah, but Trump started this kind of talk. Okay, well, point granted. It's still not,
right.
But the issue is that this is becoming a pattern that is metastasizing. It's multiplying.
Right. Well,
right?
I would say there's the anger and the vulgarity that you see on both sides. I think a lot of Democrats would say that Trump's language also had an element of bigotry.
Sure.
Insofar as the language directed at women.
But if what we're concerned about, and it is what we're concerned about, right?
Right.
If what we're concerned about is creating a political environment and an institutional culture that allows for us to intelligently and empathetically sort of understand each other across these very large and complex ideological and cultural differences, then we need to have, part of what we need is to have leaders who take that project seriously and who are committed to the idea that even if they don't personally like or respect some of the people they're negotiating with on the other side of the table, each and every person they're going to be working with in Congress and in the White House represents a vast part of the American people whose basic sort of commitment to respecting is going to be necessary to assuring the common good of all of the American people.
Right.
So, look, man, I have a very similar critique and disappointment with Republicans who it seemed to me went way out of their way to impugn and ridicule Barack Obama and his character and his intentions and so forth, and including in instances where it just wasn't necessary because it was an effective means of galvanizing, the conservative base and the conservative viewership on talk for cable news and talk radio, etc.
Well, they were just shining light on the fact that he was born in Kenya and was a devout Muslim.
Yeah, sure, and all
to be cheeky.
Yeah,
but I agree with what you're saying. Taken. I think, and you put it really well. And I think there's a difficult balance to be struck that can be struck in which you're staying true to your ideals and values and expressing strong but respectful opposition to conflicting values and ideals, at least insofar as you perceive them, while being open to people of all faiths, of all ideas. And I would love to see more young leaders who can do both.
Well, can I tell you who
we try to do here?
Can I tell you who I like in this freshman class on the Republican side?
Sure.
At least from
please.
From what I've seen of them so far, is Dan Crenshaw. if you're familiar with him. Dan, well, you probably do know him. Dan Crenshaw was the guy. He's the dude who looks like the pirate in the
I think I know who you're talking about.
In the freshman class. And look, I don't know all of his policy positions and so forth. He lost an eye, I think, serving in Iraq, if I'm not mistaken. He was either Army or Marine. I forget which. And he's the guy who, what's his name, on SNL did a bit sort of clowning on the different,
the guy who
Pete Davidson.
Temporarily engaged to Ariana Grande.
Right. And actually, it was a wonderful Better Angels moment. We shared it on our social media and so forth, where, the setup was Davidson basically was teasing Crenshaw for his appearance.
Blow.
Yeah, said he looked like a cheap porn star or something like that. He referenced the eye patch and everything. Yeah. And of course, Crenshaw lost that eye defending our country. People didn't like it. But then SNL was good enough to call Crenshaw on the phone and invite him on the show. And Crenshaw was good enough to accept. So he goes on the show, and he cracks some jokes about Pete Davidson and his appearance. Turns out Pete Davidson's father died in 9/11. Right. And so
I did not know that.
Well, they talked about that in that segment at the very end. I think it was a somber but a powerful moment where they each referenced the phrase that we've carried out of that: "Never forget." Right. In honor of Dan's sacrifice in Iraq, but also Pete's father's sacrifice on 9/11, and it was this moment where goodwill was extended across a vast chasm of difference between these two men, cultural figures both. And even more recently, Crenshaw put out a video. So there was I forget the guy's name. It was a black Democratic congressman from somewhere in the South, I think, who gave a speech to his church, basically maligning Donald Trump and in very literal terms, called him a racist and a Nazi and all of these other things. And, I think maybe said things that seem disparaging of all Trump supporters along similar lines and so forth. And
basket of deplorables.
Yeah, and go on a bit further than that. But Crenshaw released his own video in response to that. And, you're going to expect Republicans and conservatives about universally to be ticked about a thing like that.
Right.
But what Crenshaw said, and you can say, oh, this guy is just trying to, take the smug high road and so forth. But I viewed him as earnest. And what he said was that he said, I don't like the things you said about, this isn't a rough quote, but in essence what he said was, I don't like the things you said about President Trump. He said, but at least when you pick on Trump, you're picking on somebody your own size. He's the president of the United States.
Gives
he can
it
defend
right back
himself.
to you.
Exactly right. He said, but when you go after his supporters, you're talking about millions of decent and hardworking Americans. He said, I have differences of opinion with you. He said, but I will never attack your supporters in personal terms, because I know that there are millions of good Americans who support you politically, and I respect them. He said, and you and I can talk about this in person because my office is right down the hall from yours. He said, and I want to keep it to the issues, right?
I got to check this guy out.
Yeah. And so,
Well, I think that's why, Hillary's line about the basket of deplorables, and also Mitt Romney's line back in 2012 about 47% of Americans who are takers rather than makers, were so devastating to their campaigns, because I think people were rightly offended. Yeah. And I think that should be a first rule in political campaigns.
Mitt had the good sense to deliver that line in private. It was...
Yeah, there you go, at a fundraiser. Actually, Hillary's line was delivered at a fundraiser as well, at Cipriani on Wall Street, although it was open press. So, that should be a first rule in political campaigns, that, attack the candidate all you want, but... really shouldn't be attacking fellow Americans, and not just because it's politically dumb, because it's wrong in a lot of ways, and it is counterproductive.
Right.
So
those are the sort of norms.
Well, I got two questions for you. One, I'd just love to talk a little bit more about what leaders on both the Republican and Democratic side that you see real promise in from this sort of patriotic empathy perspective, as we said, and I have a couple thoughts too. We also mentioned the fact that you are a Republican. Obviously, you're a California Republican, which traditionally has differentiated you a little bit from the national GOP on policy a bit, but also on tone. But I just would be curious to sort of your personal reaction to see in some ways what the Republican Party, at least at a national level, has become over both the last couple years as, Trump has taken over the party and the last 10 years insofar as it's, lapsed into some of these cultural war issues. And, just as folks say, the Democratic Party has sort of started to lean more on identity politics and sort of some of these wedge issues. Some would make the argument that the Republican Party has in some ways become, white identitarian party. So just as you mentioned, as a Republican who comes from a multicultural background, have you been disappointed in this? Have you been surprised at how it's happened? And what do you think the path forward is, given the fact that, Donald Trump is going to be president for 2 more years, barring some kind of crazy event, which, let's be honest, might happen? Well,
I'm also right, and I'm also a person who is half white, whose white father comes from, baby boomer generation, and whose family is from the South originally and so forth, and who was raised with a fairly traditional outlook on what America is in many respects. And so, sure. I mean, there are various cultural windows through which I see everything you're talking about. The Republican Party, I am disappointed, I suppose, in line with your setup, that it seems to me like the Republican Party, certainly on a national level, has taken something of a U-turn from a commitment that I felt back when I was more actively involved in the party. It was on the verge of sort of embracing, which was a commitment to really learning how to connect with and speak a language that could appeal to Americans of a vastly more varied cultural and generational background than what it has shown itself willing to actually do in the present moment under Trump. And that's just a reflection of political realities on the ground that have shifted and that have carried incentives in different directions along with them. So during the Obama administration and after Romney's defeat, it seemed clear that the demographics in the United States of America were changing. If the Republican Party were going to survive politically over the long run, it needed to reach out and connect with people outside of the, outside of the older white base of the party.
And I think the RNC actually published a report. Yes, it did. To that effect.
The RNC, yes, that's right. There was a document produced within the Republican National Committee under Reince Priebus that analyzed that issue and came to that conclusion. And I was vice chairman of the GOP in LA County at the time. And, I had run a campaign against Maxine Waters that, on an internal party level, just in our own corner of the party, sort of made some of these arguments. And I was looking forward to being a part of a Republican Party that was choosing to step in that constructive direction. By the way, that math has not changed. What happened was that Donald Trump, I think, had, as a candidate, he had an appeal to white working class voters, which did, particularly among certain areas of, the white working class in this country that Mitt Romney did not have a similar appeal to, that John McCain did not have a similar appeal to.
Absolutely.
But I would still maintain that his victory, it may be unfair to say it was accidental, but it was almost accidental.
Well, and also those same folks to whom Obama had some appeal in 2008. Obama won Indiana, he won Iowa, he was able to connect with some of these same folks you're talking about.
Right. That was precisely politically speaking the most powerful and constructive thing that Trump did, was manage to appeal perhaps to the cultural but also to the economic interests of Rust Belt Democrats in swing states who voted for Obama on the basis of their perceived self-interest and then voted for Trump on the basis of their perceived self-interest. And, these are Americans, I think, that Romney and McCain never quite had the same sort of connection to. But nevertheless, Trump won those swing states by razor-thin margins. He won.
Don't remind me.
You were there, right?
Yeah.
On the other side, he won them all, but he won each one by what? Like, I mean, I'm not familiar with the. I can't remember the exact margins.
Votes in Michigan or something
like
that.
Less than a percentage point in virtually each case. In Michigan, in Wisconsin,
right?
Ohio.
Well, Ohio
was a bigger margin of victory.
I think he took by like 6 or 7 points. Okay. Although Sherrod Brown, a Democrat, won quite handily, and so I think that goes to show that it isn't necessarily, the polarization is there, but there are these individuals like Barack Obama, like Sherrod Brown, like Donald Trump, who can sort of scramble things. I would just
because not everybody's concern is so locked into the ideology or the cultural sort of dynamic. Some people really are concerned about, being able to take care of their families and so forth.
Joe Manchin in West Virginia, for example. Well, I would just make 2 quick points about what you said. I think one, yes, I think Trump was able to win because he was able to really energize these white working class voters. I think one reason that he won those states was Hillary sort of failed to turn out a lot of the Democratic base supporters that Obama had turned out. And I think also just you talking about your background again reminded me of Barack Obama, someone who was half white and was actually raised by his mother who was white and his 2 grandparents who were white who came from the
Kansas,
heartland.
From Kansas.
And then I think one of the ironic things, is Obama was, otherized by elements on the right is, he would say, well, I am half white. I grew up in that background. I think that's why he was able to speak to some of these folks. But I think that sort of better angels approach, which I really do believe Obama has in his heart, has sort of been lost on both sides. In the current moment, and just the sort of abrupt U-turn, as you mentioned.
Obama, John McCain, Ronald Reagan, frankly. Look, man, this new polarization is not the norm in recent American political history.
Well, and it runs contrary to some of the bedrock values that have protected our country over time, as we've seen tremendous strife.
Yeah. And, it gets to be a difficult political conversation to have in some sense, because there are going to be people listening to us talk here about saying nice things about Obama or about, say, George Bush or Ronald Reagan and so forth. And, depending on your political orientation, you're likely going to be able to think of a whole lot of things about each of these presidents that you not only disagreed with, but found personally offensive on the basis of certain things they said or did.
Absolutely.
Right? Including Obama, including Reagan.
Of course.
Right?
I mean, there's a lot of people who would argue that Obama was a big polarizer.
Oh, yeah.
But I think there's a distinction to be made between impact and intention in that case, because I think certainly a big part of Obama's impact was to polarize, especially along racial lines. But I don't think he ever really had the intention that you see with Donald Trump, and that's just my view.
Now, that's interesting. It's an interesting thing that you make that point, because I tend to sympathize with that. But I also know that even with respect to Donald Trump, I mean, my dad is a big Donald Trump supporter, right? And when my dad talks about Donald Trump, his assessment of Trump is essentially that, well, look, he doesn't say things the right way a lot of times, but it's because he's letting you know he's calling things as he sees them ultimately. He may not be the most studious individual, may get his figures wrong from time to time, but at the end of the day, the reason people trust him, those who do trust him, is because they can see the fact that he's dedicated to helping the country and helping the American people and so forth. There's something a little bit inscrutable about the sort of intuitive and emotional connections that we wind up establishing with political figures who, I mean, I know you did meet Barack Obama, but in general, the American people will never meet, or even if they do, will never have some close personal connection to. A lot of us were just making snap emotional and intuitive judgments about who we think people are on the inside, both for better and for worse, right? Both in terms of what makes them good and what makes them bad. I tend to want to give people the benefit of the doubt across the board as much as I can do it, because I think that that's what sets the stage for us to have a a more constructive, not just conversation, but conversations that lead to actual constructive policy and governance.
And progress.
Right, and progress, both on the high governing level and into the grassroots cultural level.
And just how we treat our neighbors who disagree with us politically.
That's the work of Better Angels. You know? But I say all that to say that, it is a difficult thing to do to, on the one hand, commit yourself to a more holistic, empathetic way of engaging people with whom you not only disagree but may have some moral suspicions of, while also holding true to your own policy opinions, political and moral convictions and values. And yet we do have to do both of these things. We have to be able to sit across the table from each other and say, well, look, Ciaran, maybe a big, I'm just saying this hypothetically, right? But maybe a big Elizabeth Warren supporter. I happen to think that, Elizabeth Warren may not even really she may not really even believe in the American experiment. She may not even really believe in what the Constitution represents, right? But I'm going to try and treat her with respect because I need to treat you with respect, right? And vice versa,
comes down to, I think, this connection between the people and their candidate. Because I think as people...
I may think that Elizabeth Warren did something illegal or shady in her background, right? And I may have an obligation to draw some attention to that. But I still have to respect at least the office that she holds, because I've got to respect her responsibility and her leadership role for you and for the people that she represents and for the country as a whole.
I mean, she represents all the people of Massachusetts, not just the folks who agree with her, just as President Trump, represents the whole country. Yeah. And,
he is our president.
Of course. He is our president. And I think ideally you want to have somebody who, is trying to appeal to and represent all Americans rather than just a base segment. But I think your points are really well taken, and people get away from that even if they recognize the value in that. They get so caught up in the latest outrage, and it's so easy to ascribe the perceived characteristics of an individual leader to anyone who either supports them or is open to what they're saying. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Yeah. So you mentioned Liz Warren, who's obviously, I think, one of the first Democrats who's officially declared her intention to run, although I think you have some other, big-name senators like Cory Booker and Kamala Harris who are pretty much gonna run. If they didn't, it would be shocking. And then you have all sorts of folks. I mean, mayors and governors, former vice presidents. It's going to be about 55 It's wide open.
Honestly, man.
Maybe I'll run for president. Just throw my hat in there. Absolutely not.
I don't know if you're going to be legal, though, at that time.
That's true.
I don't think you'll quite be old enough in 2020.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what's messed up, man? And we can start to wrap it up towards these points. But for all the names that you just ticked off, if I had to put my money on somebody right now, the Democratic side, I'd say Biden. I think that Joe Biden is interesting because I think that he comes off in a very different way from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but he's also a guy who comes off as a human being. On a strategic level, you're going to have people say Joe can reach those white working class voters that Trump seems to, otherwise might have an advantage over the other people you mentioned in appealing to. But, Biden's got a sense of humor and a gravitas, but also a certain aggressiveness and so forth.
Yeah, what did he say? He'd like to take Trump out back? And
yeah, which wasn't the most depolarizing
He sometimes puts
statement.
his foot in his mouth. I seem to remember him calling Obama the first clean African-American.
Oh, you're taking it way back. Harry Reid said something similar.
Harry Reid, man.
I think I told you.
He let it all hang out.
I think I told you I had a high-level Republican official refer to me as the most articulate African-American that he knew or something like that.
Yeah, expected me to be a bit of a backhanded
probably expected
compliment.
me to be. I'm forgiving of people.
Well, do you remember when Harry Reid, during the 2012 campaign, I think he just got up on the Senate floor and said, I have it on good authority that Mitt Romney paid no taxes last year. Yeah. Which, of course, turned out to be false.
I do remember that. It was just
and, Harry Reid is a brawler, but not to get off track there.
Yeah. But, I've got no idea what's going to happen in the Democratic field. There's obviously a lot of names. It's possible that Trump winds up facing a primary opponent. If he did, seems like it would be Mitt Romney, or at least Romney would. Now, Romney has said he's not going to do that. He said he's not going to run. But, Romney has probably said that before and then ran. And
I don't think he'd have much of a shot against Trump among the Republican base, to be honest.
Probably not. But if things got so rocky, in the Trump administration, that depending on what the Mueller investigation, reveals.
I don't know, man.
But Romney wrote an op-ed. What was that? Was it in the New York Times or in the Washington
Post?
Right.
Liberal rag.
Yeah, and he made a lot of points that I definitely sympathize with and so forth. Ultimately, though, we do need people on both sides to be serious about the project of respecting not just their political opposition, but even more importantly, the American people themselves, right? And to recognize the fact that creating bridges of understanding to the Americans who disagree with you and who have a very different sort of, set of life circumstances than you have, that's got to be the number one, I feel, priority.
And just not writing them off.
To lead the American people. Yeah.
Not writing them off as somehow, irredeemable or inherently irrational or...
I mentioned Dan Crenshaw. I think Ben Sass...
or incomprehensible, really.
Yeah. I think Ben Sass on the Republican side also, I think, has a way of talking about politics, which captures a lot of those values. Look, man, they're good people across the board. Now, we may not see the best angels of everybody's nature shining forth in the context of what we see of our leaders in Congress and, in the media and so forth. And a lot of that has to do with the structures of our institutions and the ways in which even people who might want to act a different way feel that they're held captive by the political necessity of, rallying the base in opposition to other forces so that they can gain leverage towards putting actual good ideas on the table and getting things done.
But I do think it can be done. I do think, of course, in 2020, you're going to have a lot of Democratic candidates who are just, fire and brimstone, anti-Trump all the time, saying this is something different. This is a fundamental threat to American democracy. In these instances, you just need to stand up and, say what's right and say what's wrong. Right. But I do think there are some candidates out there who might be able to walk this line between, being a strong progressive, motivating the base to turn out, while speaking to common values and extending a hand to all Americans. I think there's some interesting mayors who might run. I think, mayors...
You mentioned that guy...
Buttigieg. Mayor Pete.
I butchered that.
Yeah, Buttigieg is a really interesting figure. He's the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, which is where he grew up. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He served in Afghanistan. He's also openly gay. He'd be the first millennial candidate. You have some people like Mitch Landria, or Landra. I don't know how I'm pronouncing it. He's a French. Mayor of New Orleans, who gave a really powerful, nuanced speech about the issue of Confederate statues. That ultimately, I think, placed more value in the position of needing to take them down, but also sort of spoke to the other side and recognized their position and sort of the long history. So, because I think at the end of the day, mayors have to get stuff done.
Sure.
And they also have to operate in a fact-based world, unlike sometimes national politics. If one of your constituents says, I got a pothole on my road, you can't really say, no, you don't.
Yeah, you can reach out and touch a mayor, much of the time. I mean, Los Angeles is a little different because L.A. is basically a country more than it is a city. But
yeah,
but in general, yeah. Now, you've never had a mayor become president, but clearly all the old rules are out the window now anyway. So whoever they are, Republican, Democrat, I'm going to be hoping for them to call out the better angels of their nature. And in the meantime, man, I think you and I are going to be doing our things with the people and trying to create a new way of talking about politics and doing politics. on the grassroots level and beyond. So no matter what happens in 2020, I think that everybody here listening to us can take consolation in the fact that you can do a lot to make this country a better place and to build a better politics. So.
Well, it starts at the grassroots level, both as individuals, communities, constituents, and Americans. You know, the same approach and lessons and values sort of shine through regardless of the level on which you're operating. So to your point, I think 2020, if nothing else, will be interesting. It'll be interesting to sort of see how the different approaches candidates shake out, both in terms of overall philosophical and moral approaches, and also the tactics they use. Because I think people have different ideas about what works and how to reach voters in this new digital age. So all sorts of interesting factors. But I think the work of Better Angels will continue. I think we have a certain moral clarity about our work, which makes it feel good to wake up every day and open your computer to a torrent of emails from volunteers across the country. You know, it's inspiring. And
also helps me get through all of the negative and nasty headlines.
Well, there you go.
It's get from everybody else, right?
It's an antidote to cynicism. And, you know, even if we never end up, you know, influencing a candidate at a national scale, although I do believe we will, you know, I take inspiration in the fact that I think we've already, you know, created positive change in the lives of thousands of Americans over the course of the past few months. And that in itself is pretty amazing. So we invite anyone to join us. You know, go to our website and look out for the State of the Union, because I think that's going to be an interesting, unique, and dare I say historic event in American history. This sort of Better Angels State of the Union, and people gathering in living rooms across the country, have some popcorn, have a beer if you so desire.
That's right.
And get it going. Get it popping.
Yes, sir. We'll have a link in the description below so you can see how you can get involved with that. 2020 is going to be fascinating, but man, we are at the beginning of 2019.
Yeah, man, it's crazy.
It's going to be
crazy when you see these celebrities these days and they're born in like 2001.
I know, right?
And you're just like, oh man.
It's like, wait a second, how could you be?
I'm getting old.
How could you be a celebrity born in 2001? That makes
or like you're playing in the NFL. Then it's just like,
then you realize, man, we were supposed to been have flying cars at this point.
Yeah, seriously.
Instead, here we are trying to save democracy.
Come on, Elon.
Like,
you know,
right?
Step it up. What are you doing smoking weed on podcasts? You know?
Yeah, exactly.
Let's get the cars up in the air.
Well, sometimes you got to take a step backwards to take two forward. So that's
true. Well, I think that's true for the country too.
Yeah, man. Happy New Year, brother.
Happy New Year. Happy 2019.